Welcome to Reading the Time Away. I hope this brings you a moment of relaxation in our crazy world. Helmet and Spear, Stories from the Wars of the Greeks and Romans, by the Reverend A.J. Church. Book 1, Greece and Persia, The Defense, The Men of Marathon. We may say of wars what a famous philosopher said of revolutions, that they happen about little things, but spring from great causes. When Herodotus, at the beginning of his history, proceeds to put on record the grounds of the great feud between the Greeks and the barbarians, he tells us of various outrages committed by one party or the other. The Phoenicians began by carrying off Io, daughter of Inachus. The Greeks retaliated by landing at Tyre and bearing away the king's daughters Europe. This they followed by the capture of Medea, a princess of Colchi. When Paris of Troy ran away with the fair Helen from Sparta, he was only setting the account straight. It was then that, according to the Persian sages, with whom Herodotus seems to agree, the Greeks made a fatal mistake. They actually led a great army into Asia to recover a worthless woman, though men of sense care nothing about such people. The fact is that the Greeks, as a very enterprising and active race, came into frequent collision with their eastern neighbors. We catch glimpses of this in very remote times. To these, however, we need not go back. Towards the end of the 8th or early in the 7th century BC, the kings of Lydia began to encroach on their Greek neighbors and conquered city after city. Croesus, who was the last of the dynasty, had made himself a master of all of them before he was himself overthrown by Cyrus the Persian. This event meant nothing for the Greeks but a change of masters, and this was not a change for the better. Lydians and Greeks had long been neighbors, and could contrive to live on tolerable terms. The Persians were strangers from a remote country, and were of a harsher temper. In 502 BC, a general rebellion took place, in the course of which Sardi, the local capital of the Persians, was burnt. A contingent of Athenian troops took part in this affair, and their presence was the immediate cause of the great struggle that followed. The war between Greece and Persia lasted, with intervals of doubtful peace, something less than 180 years. The first great conflict was a marathon. In the late summer of 490 BC, the Persian army landed at the Bay of Marathon, distant from Athens about 20 miles as the crow flies, about 25 by the only road practicable for wheeled conveyances. Of the Persian numbers we know nothing. Herodotus, who is our best authority, born in 480, he probably talked with men who had fought in the battle, gives no figures. Later writers speak of impossible numbers, 600,000 being the largest, 110,000 the smallest estimate. To carry even 110,000 across the Aegean Sea would have been a heavy task. If a guess had to be made, one may venture to say 60,000. The Athenians numbered 10,000, and they had with them 1,000 men from Plataea, a little Boeotian town, which they had recently taken under their protection. The plain of Marathon is about 6 miles long from southwest to northeast, and in breadth varies from 2.5 to 1.5 miles. On the northeast it is bounded by a great marsh, which is divided from the sea by a narrow strip of land. There is another smaller marsh on the southwest. Along the edge of the swamp ran the road to Athens. It was probably the immediate object of Datish, the Persian general, to seize this road, and of the Athenian commanders to protect it. Their right wing rested on the seaward slope of what is now called Agriliki, the northeastern spur of Pentelicus. About a mile from this may still be seen the remains of the mound which was raised over the bones of the Athenians slain in the battle. It is probable that this marks the spot where the fight raged most fiercely. If this is so, the Persian lines must have been advanced to within a short distance of the rising ground. The Athenians, on learning the actual approach of the Persian forces, had sent a swift runner to Sparta to beg for help. The man reached Sparta, a distance of about 140 miles, in less than 48 hours. On the second day is the expression. The Spartans promised to come, but could not start, they said, till after the full moon, which was then 5 days off. The question then among the Athenian generals, there were 10 in number and had each his day of command, was whether they should fight at once or wait for the Spartan contingent. The 10 generals who shared the command of the army were equally divided in opinion, but Miltiades, the most distinguished of their number, was eager for instant action, and succeeded in winning over to his views Clamachus, the polemarch, with whom it lay in case of an equal division to give the casting vote. We shall see that he had good reasons for his action, and that his promptitude saved Athens, and we may say Greece. The center of the Persian line of battle was held by the native Persians in Sikaea. These latter a tribe now represented by the Turkomans. Of the rest of the formation we are told nothing. Some cavalry they had, but it is not mentioned as taking any part in the battle. It has been conjectured that it had not been disembarked when the battle was fought. It would certainly have been difficult to get the horses on board again, and if any number of them had been captured, we should probably have heard something about it. The Athenian line was drawn up so as to be equal in length to the Persian. To effect this, it was, of course, necessary to make it very thin in parts. This was the case in the center, where there were but 2 or 3 files. No light-armed soldiers, no archers, no cavalry were present. All were heavily armed men with a few slaves and attendants. The right wing was commanded by Climachus. The Plataeans were on the left. There was, as has been said, a space of a mile between the 2 armies. Miltiades ordered the Athenians to cross this at a run. Such a thing had never been done before in regular warfare. It was an amazing feat of strength, for the men were in heavy armor. Not less remarkable was the courage of the movement, for in those days the Greeks had not learned to look down upon the Persians. To the enemy, the charge seemed to be the act of madmen, but they must have felt that such madmen were dangerous enemies, and must have been shaken in the confidence with which they had looked forward to victory. Still, they stood their ground, and met their assailants in hand-to-hand fight. They even broke the center of the Athenian line, which has been said was but 2 or 3 files deep. Herodotus even says that they pursued them into the middle country, a curious phrase, seeing that the battle was fought only a mile or so from the seashore. But in hand-to-hand fighting, when the conditions were at all equal, the Persians were no match, either in training or in equipment, for their adversaries. The poet Aeschylus, himself a man of Marathon, the proudest title which an Athenian could bear, speaks of the war of the Persian against the Greek as the battle of the bow against the spear. In the Persei, the drama which celebrates the crushing defeat of Persia in its second assault on Greece, he makes the chorus, consisting of the great king's counselors, boast of how their lord would bid arrows iron hail advance against the cumbrous moving lance. A happy stroke of irony when it was known that the lance had prevailed over the arrow. It certainly prevailed that day. Both the wings were victorious in the shock of arms, and when they had put to flight the ranks opposed to them turned to restore the fortune of the day in the center. This they soon accomplished. Before long, the whole Persian line was in rapid retreat. Pausanias says that many of the fugitives rushed into the marsh, and indeed that the greater part of their loss was thus caused. Miltiades, anxious to complete his victory, followed up the flying enemy and endeavored to cut off his retreat. Here he was less successful, and indeed incurred serious loss. In the attempt to burn the Persian ships, not a few distinguished Athenians fell. The Polemarch and another of the Greek generals were among them. So was a brother of the poet Aeschylus, who, having laid hold of one of the ships, had his hand cut off by an axe, and died of it. The Persians contrived to get away, not losing more than 7 of their ships, but leaving behind them in their richly furnished tents an ample booty for the conquerors. Athens, however, was not yet safe. Hippias, who along with his brother had once held despotic power in the city and had been driven into exile 20 years before, had come with the Persian army, hoping that his friends, for he still had a party that plotted for his return, would move in his favor. They did not altogether fail him. When the Persians had re-embarked, a signal, a polished shield flashing in the sunlight, was perceived on the summit of Pentaclus. This was to indicate that the Persians should take advantage of the absence of the army and sail around to Athens, and that the party of Hippias was ready to act. Part of the fleet accordingly took the direction of Cape Sunium, which it would have to round before it could reach Athens. Miltiades seems to have been aware of what was intended, and at once gave orders to march back to Athens with all haste. This was done, and the traitors were foiled. The Persian fleet, it will be seen from the map, would have to make a circuit of about 60 miles, while the army would have to march less than half that distance. The Persian loss is put down by Herodotus at 6,200, a moderate figure which is very probably near the truth. Of the Athenians, 192 were slain. They were buried on the field of battle, and a mound heaped over their remains. On the top of this were placed 10 stone pillars, one for each of the Athenian tribes, inscribed with the names of the slain. An 11th pillar commemorated the Plataeans, a 12th the slaves who fell in the great victory. After the death of Miltiades, a monument was erected to him on the same spot. The pillars have long since perished, but the mound remains. It is 30 feet high and about 200 yards in circumference. It was excavated in 1890-91 by order of the Greek government and found to contain human remains, with pottery of the very period of the battle. Writing about 6 centuries later, Pausanias says, "Here every night you may hear horses neighing and men fighting," and adds that it brings bad luck to go out of curiosity, but that with him who unwillingly lights upon it by accident, the spirits are not angry. The same tradition lingers about many of the great battlefields of the world. Shepherds who fled their flocks on the plains of Troy saw specters in armor, and conspicuous among them the spirit of the great Achilles. The scenes of the great battles of Attila and Charlemagne are still said to be thus haunted. It only remains to say that 2,000 Spartans arrived on the day after the battle, that they went to the field of battle to see the Persian dead, and after greatly praising the Athenians, returned home. Chapter 2. The Lion King. Darius was not by any means disposed to take his repulse at Marathon as final. On the contrary, he at once set to work on making preparations for a new expedition, which should this time be one of overwhelming force, and which he determined to lead in person. A revolt which broke out in Egypt probably delayed him for a time. Anyhow, he died in 485 before his preparations were complete. He had reigned for 36 years and was probably in his 68th year. Xerxes, the eldest of the sons born after his accession to the throne, succeeded him without any opposition. He is said to have been averse to the scheme of an invasion, but was persuaded by those who were interested in promoting it. However this may be, the preparations were not seriously interrupted. The Egyptian insurrection was put down, and in the autumn of 481, the army intended for the invasion of Greece was assembled at Sardis. The story of the events that followed must be sought elsewhere, for I am not attempting to give a narrative of the Persian War. It must suffice to say that by August 490, the Persian army had occupied Thessaly. It was at the famous pass which leads from this region into Low Crete that the Greeks made their first stand. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, consisted of two narrow passes, neither of them of greater width than one wheeled carriage would require, caused by the near approach of Mount Oeta to the sea, or rather to an impassable morass which here formed the coastline. It is well to remark that considerable changes have taken place in the character of the country, the coastline in particular having receded a long way eastward. The easternmost of the two passes was that to which the name properly belonged, for here there were actual hot springs, dedicated to Hercules, and supplying medicinal baths. Between the two passes, the distance of a mile, the mountain receded from the sea, leaving a level space of about half a mile broad. At Thermopylae proper, there was a wall built by the Locrians, but at the time of which we are speaking, it had fallen into ruins. It was here that Leonidas, one of the two kings of Sparta, took up his position, late, it would seem, in July. He had with him 300 Spartans, 2,500 soldiers from other parts of the Peloponnesus, a contingent of 700 from Thespia, one of the Boeotian towns, which dissented strongly from the pro-Persian views of their countrymen, and 400 Thebans, who came on compulsion. Thebes did not venture to refuse the demands of Leonidas while their Persian friends were still a long way off. He was also joined by contingents of the Locrians and the Phocians. Both tribes had given in or were about to give in their submission to the Persians, but probably preferred the success of the Greeks. In any case, they were not prepared to resist the Greek commander-in-chief, present as he was with a much superior force. Leonidas at once strengthened his position by repairing the half-ruined wall by the hot springs, but he learned that Thermopylae was not the only way by which access could be had from northern to southern Greece. The Phocians informed him that there was a mountain path which led from a point beyond the westernmost pass to another point beyond the defile of the hot springs, but they promised that they would guard it. The fact came, of course, to the knowledge of the troops generally, and greatly discouraged them. They even wished to abandon Thermopylae altogether. Those that came from the Peloponnese were especially urgent, believing that they had a much better position for defense in the Isthmus of the Corinth. Leonidas refused to retreat, but he sent messengers to the various Greek states with an urgent demand for reinforcements. The forces that he had with them were wholly unequal, he said, to cope with such an army as the Persians had at their command. Xerxes, who had encamped within sight of Thermopylae, sent a horseman to reconnoiter the position of Leonidas. The Spartans were on guard that day in front of the wall, and the man observed that some were engaged in athletic exercises, while others were combing their long hair. Demaratus, an exiled king of Sparta, who was with Xerxes, when questioned about the meaning of this behavior, told him that his countrymen were particularly careful with their toilet when engaged in any dangerous enterprise, and that he must expect a desperate resistance. "You have to deal," he went on, "with the first city of Greece, and with her bravest men." "But how can so small a company contend with mine?" asked Xerxes, who had not yet learnt to doubt his big battalions. The king was unwilling to believe him, and waited for 4 days in the expectation that the Greeks would think better of their purpose to resist, and would retire without a conflict. On the 5th day, finding that the Greeks were still in their positions, Xerxes sent the Medes and the men of Siscia, now Khuzestan, with instructions to take the Greeks alive and bring them into his presence. These troops rushed with the greatest courage to the attack. Many were slain, for indeed they were no match for the Greeks in hand-to-hand fighting, but others stepped into their places. The struggle went on during the whole day, with no result except heavy loss to the assailants. On the morrow, Xerxes sent his Persian corps d'elite, which went by the name of the Immortals, to the attack, confident that they would be able to force the pass. They met with no better success. Their spears were shorter than those used by the Greeks, and the narrowness of the battlefield did not allow them to take advantage of their superiority in numbers. Herodotus makes special mention of the practiced skill which the Spartans displayed. One of their methods was to feign flight, lure the assailants on, and then turn on them with deadly effect. Vast numbers of the Persians were slain. The Greeks also suffered some loss, for the best troops of the east could not have fought wholly in vain, but this loss was very small. Thrice during the day's engagement, the Persian king is said to have leapt from the seat from which he watched the combat in terror for his army. Yet another day was spent in fruitless assault on the Greek position. The Persians hoped to wear out the enemy by incessant attacks. Some must be slain or wounded, and when the total number was so small, even a small loss must tell upon them in the end. As a matter of fact, however, the strength of the Greeks was not sensibly impaired. The space of the ground that had been held was very small, and the Greeks could change their men actually engaged at frequent intervals. The treachery of a native of Mali, a little Dorian state in the heart of the mountains, relieved Xerxes of his perplexity. He offered, for a reward, to show a mountain path by which the Greek position could be turned. The name of this wretch, on whose head a price was set by the general council of the Greek states, was Ephialtes. It is doubtful whether the secret could have been long kept, but there seems to have been a general agreement that Ephialtes was the guilty man, though other names were mentioned. Xerxes willingly purchased the secret and entrusted the task of outflanking the Greek position to the Immortals. They started at dusk and marched all night. The Phocian guards of the path seemed to have neglected to place any outposts, and were not aware of the approach of the enemy till the crackling of the leaves under their feet, carried through the still air of night, gave them warning. They started up from their bivouac at the sound, and the Persians, surprised at the sight of an enemy whose presence they had not expected, halted. The Phocians seemed not to have attempted to hold the path, but retreated to the crest of the hill, and then made ready to defend themselves. The Persians left them alone, and continued their march. The Greeks at Thermopylae had by this time received a warning of what had happened. The soothsayer attached to the force is said to have read in the victims which he examined a prognostic of their fate. More definite information came from scouts who had been out on the hills, and who now came hurrying into the camp with the news. A council of war was hastily held. It could not agree, but the result was that the majority of the contingents retreated. Whether they did this with or without the orders of Leonidas is not certain. It is one of the matters about which it is almost impossible to arrive at the truth. Herodotus thinks that they were ordered to retire by Leonidas because he saw that they were unwilling to stay. This has a look of probability. As for Leonidas himself and the Spartans, they elected to stay. The inflexible military honor of their commonwealth forbade retreat. The 700 Thespians refused to depart, and must be allowed the glory of a still more heroic courage. The Theban contingent was detained against its will. The soothsayer Megistias, his name ought to be preserved no less carefully than that of the traitor Ephialtes, refused to depart, though being not a Spartan, but an Achaemenian by birth, he might have done so without discredit, but he sent away his only son. The name of the Thespian leader ought also to have his place on the roll of honor. It was Demophilus. In the forenoon, the Persians began a double attack, in front and in rear. They had seen such proofs of Greek prowess that the men had to be driven into battle by the whip. As for the Greeks, they changed their tactics. Leaving the pass of the hot springs and the wall, they advanced into the open space. Hope of escape or victory had been given up. They would fight where they could sell their lives most dearly, and dearly did they sell them. Crowds of the Persians fell. Many were trampled underfoot by their comrades. Many more were thrust into the marsh, and that bordered the road on the side of the sea. Among the slain were 2 brothers of the king. The Spartans and Thespians fought till their spears were broken. Leonidas seems to have fallen early in the day, and there was a furious struggle for the possession of his body. 4 times did the barbarians carry it off, and 4 times was it recovered. As the day drew on, the Immortals came upon the scene. Aware of the approach, the Greeks retreated to the pass, and prolonged their resistance to the very utmost. When their weapons failed them, they used their hands and even their teeth. But the Persians now surrounded them and showered arrows and all kinds of missiles upon them. They perished to a man. One more name from among the 300 Spartans must be preserved, Dionysius, who seems to have been a wit as well as a warrior. When a man of Trachis told him that the Persians were so numerous that their arrows would darken the sun, "'Tis well," he replied, "stranger, then we shall fight in the shade." One of the contingent was absent. He and a comrade had been lying sick at a neighboring village. They could not agree as to what should be done. One buckled on his armor and bade his attendant Helot lead him, for he could not see, to the battlefield. The Helot did so, and then turned and fled. His master plunged into the thick of the fight and fell. The other sick man returned to Sparta. There, no one would give him light to kindle his fire or speak to him. He wiped away the reproach by falling, after prodigies of valor, at Plataea. Chapter 3. In the Straits. While the army of the allied Greeks was holding the pass of Thermopylae, their fleet occupied Artemisium. This was a promontory at the northern end of the Isle of Euboea, a small stretch of coast on either side of the actual cape being known by the same name. The Persian attack was being made by both land and sea, and the Greek plan of defense was to check it at 2 points, which were as nearly as possible in a line. Both positions were liable to be turned. The danger at Artemisium was even greater than at Thermopylae, for there was nothing to prevent the Persian fleet from sailing down the east coast of Euboea. Indeed, we shall see that this was done, though, as it turned out, without any ill result to the Greeks. It is clear that the officers in command of the fleet were quite as uneasy as some of the army leaders at Thermopylae, nor was there anyone who could exercise the control that Leonidas, in virtue of his commanding personality and his rank as a Spartan king, exercised over the allies. An event of no great importance turned this uneasiness into panic. 2 out of 3 ships which had been detached to keep a lookout were captured by an advanced Persian squadron of 10 ships. In consequence of this disaster, the fleet hastily retreated some 50 miles to the south, to a spot where the channel between the mainland and Euboea is at its narrowest. It would probably have gone still further south but for the heavy loss which the Persian fleet suffered during a 4-day storm. No less than 400 ships were destroyed, and with them an uncounted multitude of men. The Greeks were so encouraged by the loss which had befallen the enemy that they returned in all haste and took up their former station, hence the Battle of Artemisium. The first incident was a Greek success. The Persian fleet took up its position in the great natural harbor which is now known as the Gulf of Volo. 15 ships belonging to it lagged so far behind the rest that by the time they reached the southeastern point of the Gulf, the main body had rounded it and were out of sight. But the Greek fleet was in full view. They mistook it for their own, sailed straight towards it, and were captured without a struggle. Notwithstanding this stroke of good fortune, the Greek captains were full of fears. Even after the losses caused by the storm, the Persian fleet greatly outnumbered their own. They had 280 ships, reckoning 950 oars, with the larger triremes or 3-bankers. The Persians must have had more than twice as many. The question of retreat again came up, and seemed very likely to be decided in the affirmative. A different result was brought about by a proceeding curiously characteristic of Greek ways of acting and thinking. The people of Euboea were in despair at the prospect of being deserted. It would be something, they thought, if they could secure a few days' grace in which to remove their portable property to a place of safety. They went to Eurybiades, the Spartan admiral, who was in supreme command, and begged him to postpone his departure for a short time. He refused the request. It would not, he said, be for the public interest. Then they went to Themistocles, the Athenian admiral. He was not the commander-in-chief, but he commanded the most numerous contingent, 127 ships, only 13 short of the half. They offered him a splendid bribe of 30 talents, about 7,000 pounds of our money, if he could procure for them the desired delay. Themistocles seems to have known the price of the men whom he had to buy. To Eurybiades he gave 5 talents, and the Spartan, to whom this sum probably seemed a fortune, changed his views about the public safety. The Corinthian commander, who had the most powerful squadron after that of Athens, had also to be bought. Themistocles dealt with him in the frankest way. "I will give you," he said, "more for staying than the Persians will give you for going." The Corinthian does not seem to have resented the suggestion that he was ready to be bribed by the enemies of his country, and accepted the 2 talents which Themistocles sent on board his ship. The Athenian kept the handsome balance in his own hands. We cannot say anything more for him than that he comes out of the transaction better than his colleagues. They believed that the better and safer course was to retreat. He, on the contrary, was convinced that the right policy was to stop and fight, but he never forgot his personal interests. In this case, he made them harmonize. On other occasions, his action was more doubtful. There is reason to think that, before the end of his career, he postponed the public good to his own. The Persians, when they saw that the Greek fleet was still at Artemisium, had, it would seem, no thought but of how they might make sure of capturing the whole. They sent a squadron of 200 ships to sail down the eastern coast of Euboea. These were to take the Greek in their rear, the main body waiting till the arrival of the squadron had been signaled. Meanwhile, the Greeks had received some encouraging intelligence. A Greek diver named Sicyles, who had been in the employ of the Persians, deserted to them. He described the damage that had been done by the storm, and also informed them about the squadron that had been sent around Euboea. The first thought of the Greek admirals was to sail south and meet this squadron. But on reflection, bolder counsels prevailed. Late in the afternoon they left their station, and sailed toward the hostile fleet. The Persians viewed the movement with astonishment, and the Asiatic Greeks with dismay, for though serving with the enemy, they wished well to their countrymen. The Greek ships were inferior, not only in numbers, but also in equipment, and they seemed to be rushing on destruction. The Greeks began by assuming what seemed like a defensive position, forming a circle, with the sterns of their ships in close order, and the prows turned to the enemy. The enemy advanced to close with them, and then, at a concerted signal, the Greeks dashed at their opponents with such success that they captured 30 of their ships, the first prize falling, as indeed was fitting, to an Athenian ship. The Persians, recovered from the first surprise, began to hold their own better, and when night fell, the issue of the conflict was still doubtful. The captain of a ship from the island of Lemnos had the sagacity to see how the struggle would end, and he deserted to the Greeks, receiving afterwards a handsome reward for his timely patriotism. Again, the stars fought in their courses for Greece. That night there was a thunderstorm, heavy rain and wind. The main body of the fleet did not suffer much material damage, but the crews were dismayed to see fragments of wrecks and bodies of the dead drifted in by the wind. These were, indeed, the tokens of a greater disaster. The squadron that was sent round Euboea had been driven on a lee shore and absolutely destroyed. On the morrow the Persians made no movement, but the Greeks repeated the tactics of the day before. The news of the disaster to the Persian squadron had reached them, and they had been joined by a reinforcement of Athenian ships. This gave them new courage besides increasing their strength. Before the close of the day, they captured some Sicilian ships. On the third day, the Persian commanders, made desperate by failure, for they served a master exacted a cruel penalty for ill success, moved forward to engage the enemy, the Greeks awaiting their attack. The order of the Persian attack was in the shape of a half-moon, and its object to outflank the enemy on either side. The Greeks accepted the challenge, but the result was not decisive. The Greeks sunk and captured more ships than they themselves lost, but their own loss was serious. Of the Athenian fleet especially, more than half was so injured as to require repair. By this time, too, the position had ceased to have any strategic value. The pass of Thermopylae had been forced by the Persians, and it was useless, therefore, to hold Artemisium. That night the Greek fleet retired southwards. Themistocles, before he went, caused to be engraved on a prominent rock an inscription which invited the Asiatic Greeks serving with the Persians to make common cause with their countrymen. If these words, he reasoned with himself, escape the knowledge of the king, they may bring these Greeks over to us. If they come to his knowledge, they will make him distrust them. Chapter 4. The Wooden Walls. The retreat of the Greek forces from Thermopylae and Artemisium left Athens without defense. There had been a promise that an army of the allies should make a stand against the invaders in Boeotia. No attempt was made to keep it. The only plan of defense that commended itself to the Peloponnesian states was to fortify the isthmus of Corinth. And all the states outside the Peloponnesus, Athens expected, were either pro-Persian or indifferent. As Athens was unwalled, there was no question of defending it. The only thing that could be done was to save as much life and property as was possible. For this the time was short, and might have been shorter than it actually was, for the Athenians had 6 days in which to transport their belongings to a place of safety, though the distance to be traversed by the invaders was not more than 90 miles. All the women, children, and persons incapacitated by illness or old age were put on shipboard and carried either to Trojan, a friendly city in the peninsula of Argyle, which had some tie of kinship with Athens, to Aegina, which was but 10 miles away, or to Salome, which was even nearer. The Athenians begged the allies to remain in the neighborhood till the work of transport was accomplished, and Salome happened to be the most convenient spot for this purpose. The whole fighting strength of Athens was now embarked in its fleet. Years before, Themistocles, with a sagacity and prescience that seem almost miraculous, had counseled his countrymen to spend all their available resources in building ships. And only a few months before, the Oracle of Delphi had advised the Athenians to trust in their wooden wall, a phrase which the same statesman had interpreted as meaning the ships. No one, we may believe, knew better what it meant, as he had probably suggested it. The time had now come to put this counsel into practice. Every able-bodied Athenian took service in the fleet, the wealthy aristocrats, known as the knights, setting the examples by hanging up their bridles in the temple of Athena. It had never been the intention of the officers in command of the allied fleet to give battle at Salome. They thought of nothing but the safety of the Peloponnesus. Possibly they believed that nothing more than this could be hoped for. But when the Athenians, compelled as they were to abandon their city, asked for their help in saving non-combatants and such property as could be removed, they could not refuse. And now the question presented itself. Where are we to meet the Persian fleet? The captains assembled in the ship of Eurybiades the Spartan, who was in chief command, and debated on what was to be done. The general opinion was that they should retire from Salome, from which there would be great difficulty in escaping, if escape should become necessary, and give battle somewhere off the coast of the Peloponnesus. In the midst of the discussion, a messenger arrived with the news that the Persians had overrun all Attica, and had taken by storm the citadel of Athens, which a few enthusiasts had insisted on defending. These tidings could not have taken anyone by surprise, but the fact that one of the great cities of Greece had fallen into the hands of the barbarians produced a panic. Some of the captains left without waiting for the decision of the council, and hurrying to their squadrons prepared to depart. Those who stayed resolved to retire to the isthmus and make a stand there. As Themistocles was returning to his ship from the council, he was met by a friend who, in bygone years, had been his instructor in philosophy. The newcomer, on hearing the decision at which the council had arrived, denounced it most emphatically. "It means ruin for Greece," he said. "The fleet will not remain together to fight. Every contingent will steal away, hoping to protect its own country. Go and persuade Eurybiades to reconsider the question." Themistocles went, and using every argument that he could think of, at last succeeded in making such an impression on Eurybiades that he consented to summon another council. Of course, it was the etiquette for the commander-in-chief to state the business which they had met to discuss. But Themistocles, who saw that it was a matter of life and death, could not help urging his case, without waiting for the president of the council. Adamantus of Corinth angrily interrupted him. "Themistocles," he said, "at the games they who start too soon are scourged." "True," replied the Athenian, "but they who start too late are not crowned." He then addressed the council in a tone of studied mildness and conciliation. He said nothing about the probability that the fleet would be broken up by a general desertion. Such an argument would have been an affront. But he urged that to fight at Salome would not be to risk everything on the issue of one battle. To retreat would be to leave all northern Greece at the mercy of the Persians, while defeat at the isthmus would mean the loss of the Peloponnesus itself. As for the Athenians, they would loyally abide by any decision to which the allies might come. Adeimantus, enraged at the Athenians' persistence, interrupted him with the remark that a man who had no country had no right to speak, and even appealed to Eurybiades to impose silence upon him. Themistocles then saw that it was time to assert himself. "With 200 ships fully manned and armed we have," he said, turning to Adeimantus, "as good a country as any man here, for what state could resist us should we choose to attack it?" Then he addressed himself to Eurybiades. "Play the man and all will be well. All depends upon our ships. If you will not stay here and fight, we will take our families on board and sail for Italy, where the gods have provided us a home. Without us, what will you do?" To this threat there was no answer. The council resolved to stay and fight. But the matter was not really settled. The Peloponnesian contingents were determined, in the last resort, to disobey their chief, and Themistocles was aware of their determination. Only one course remained for him, and it required the courage of despair to take it. If the allies would not stay at Salome of their own free will, they must do it by compulsion. He sent a trusted slave to the Persian admiral with this message: "The Athenian commander is a well-wisher to the king, and he informs you that the Greeks are seized with fear, and are about to retreat from Salome. It is for you to hinder their flight." A more daring stratagem was never put into execution. Not the least strange circumstance about it is the fact that, years after, when Themistocles had fallen into disgrace at home, he successfully claimed as a service to the Persian king that he had given him the chance of destroying the whole of the Greek fleet at one blow. The Persian commander seemed not to have suspected the good faith of the communication thus received, and at once set about closing in the Greek ships. The town of Salome was built in a little bay on the eastern side of the island, the distance across to the mainland of Attica being about 2 miles. The Greek fleet was drawn up in what may be described as the shape of a bow loosely strung, in front of the town. The Persian ships were ranged along the opposite, i.e., along the Attic shore. Both to the north and to the south the channel narrowed, being less than a mile across. The Persians now extended their line northwards till it touched the shore of the island, and southwards till it reached an uninhabited island called Pistale. On this island, they landed a body of troops who were to help the crews of any of their own ships that might be damaged, and slaughter any Greek soldiers or sailors who might be in a similar plight. While these preparations were going on, and they lasted nearly through the night, the Greek leaders still hotly debated the question of going or staying. An unexpected end was put to the controversy. The chief opponent of Themistocles in Athenian politics was Aristides. He had been banished, and at the instance of his successful rival, recalled from banishment when the danger of a Persian invasion became imminent. He now came to join his countrymen, and brought startling tidings with him. He had come from the island of Aegina, which lay some 12 miles to the south of Salome, and his ship had narrowly escaped capture making its way into the Bay of Salome. Only the darkness had made it possible to do so. Themistocles was fetched out from the council to hear the tidings. "I hope," said Aristides, "that always, and now especially, our strife will be who may do his best service to his country. As for the question of going or staying, it matters nothing whether the Peloponnesians talk much or little. Go they cannot. We are enclosed on every side. This I have seen with my own eyes." "This is good news," replied Themistocles, "for the Persians have done exactly what I wished. Our men, who would not fight of their own free will now be made to fight." And he told him of what he had done. "And now go and tell them. If I was to say it, they would not believe me." Aristides accordingly went into the council and told them his news. Many of them refused to believe it, but when a ship from the island of Tenos that had deserted from the Persians confirmed the report, there was nothing more to say. All that could be done was to make all the preparations possible for a conflict which had become inevitable. Of the battle, we have two accounts, that of Herodotus, derived doubtless from one or more persons who had taken part in it, and that of Asclepius, who actually fought there as he fought before at Marathon. The two accounts substantially agree, but they differ in the number of Greek ships engaged. Herodotus says that there were 378, made up to the round number of 380 by the Tinian ship which had deserted on the night before the battle, and a ship from Lemnos, which had done the same at Artemisia. He gives the number of each contingent, the largest being 180 contributed by Athens, while 89 came from the state of Peloponnesus, and 57 from Aegina and Euboea. One ship only came from Greece beyond the sea. Even this was a private rather than a public contribution. A certain Phallus of Crotona furnished a ship at his own expense, and manned it with fellow citizens who were sojourning in Greece. Pausanias saw his statue at Delphi 6 centuries afterwards. Asclepius says that there were 300 ships, and 10 were of special swiftness or strength. Mr. Grote thinks that this number is to be accepted in preference, hardly showing, I think, his wonted acuteness. The poet had to stage his number in verse, and finds 1030s a convenient way of doing it. But 380 would have been an unmanageable figure, and we have, accordingly, a convenient round number. Very likely Mr. Grote was not so alive to the exigencies of verse as he had been 4 years before, when he was a Charterhouse boy. As soon as the sun rose, the Greek fleet moved forward to the attack, the crews joining, as they advanced, in the Poean, or shout of battle. They met no reluctant foe. So confident indeed was the bearing of the Persians that the Greeks were checked. Some of the crews even began to backwater. The issues of great battles are often decided by examples of courage. So it was at Salome, for one of the Greek ships advanced and led the way for the rest. To whom this credit is due cannot be said for certain. The Athenians declared that this brave captain was Amenius, a brother of the poet Asclepius. The Aegyptians claimed the honor for a ship of their own, which had brought over, on the eve of the battle, the heroes worshipped in their city as auxiliaries of the Greek people. Herodotus had also heard a legend how the form of a woman, doubtless the goddess Athena, had been seen in the air and heard to cry, in a voice which reached from one end of the fleet to another, "Friends, how much further are ye going to back?" Asclepius gives his authority in favor of his countrymen, not expressly, but by saying that the ship which led the attack broke off the stern of a Phoenician ship, for we know that the Phoenician squadron was posted over against the Athenian contingent. The Aegyptian was second if not first, and Simonides gives the third place to a ship that came from Naxos. By common consent, Athens and Aegina shared the chief distinction of the day between them. The Athenian ships busied themselves with such of the enemy's fleet as offered resistance or were beached by their captains. The Aegyptians attacked those that attempted to escape by the southern channel, their way to the open sea. The subjects of Xerxes, on the whole, displayed great courage, not the less because they were fighting under the eyes of the king, who was watching the battle from a projecting point of Mount Agaleo on the mainland of Attica. The native Persians and Medes, as inland peoples, were serving as what we call marines on board the ships furnished by the maritime provinces of Phoenicia, Egypt, and Cilicia. But they seldom had the chance of showing their prowess in boarding, and when they had, they were hardly a match for their better armed and more athletic antagonists. As for the management of the ships, the sailors from the east were not, as a rule, equal either in resolution or in skill to the hardier races of the west. Their superior numbers, in the narrow space to which the battle was confined, were a hindrance rather than a help. There was no mutual confidence and no common speech, and the cogent motive that sent them into action was fear of punishment, or, at the best, obedience to a ruling race, while the Greeks were fighting for home and country. The Persian fleet was more successful where the Asiatic Greeks were matched with the squadrons from the Peloponnesus. Herodotus, himself an Asiatic Greek by birth, vindicates their honor as combatants at the expense of their Greek patriotism. I could mention, he says, the name of many captains who took ships from the Greeks. He thinks it prudent, however, to admit them, and indeed when Herodotus wrote, such exploits would be better forgotten, and gives two names only, both of them well known already. He also mentions with pleasure the signal discomfiture of some Phoenician captains, who, having lost their ships early in the day, sought to excuse themselves to Xerxes by laying the blame on the treasonable practices of the Greeks. The battle was still going on, and almost while they were speaking, a Samothracian ship was seen to ram and sink an Athenian. It was in turn disabled by an Argentinian trireme, but the Samothracian crew were expert javelin throwers. They cleared the deck of the Argentinian, boarded, and captured it. Xerxes turned fiercely on the Phoenicians in order that they should be instantly executed, as having ventured to slander men braver than themselves. Another incident of the day Herodotus relates from personal knowledge. His native city of Halicarnassus had been ruled for some years by Artemisia, the daughter of one Ligdamius, and the widow of another. She had advised Xerxes not to engage the Greek fleet, speaking with a frankness which might well have put her life in danger. Overruled by other counselors, she did her best for the king's cause, but found herself in the greatest peril. An Athenian ship was in close pursuit of her, and there was a crowd of Persian vessels in front which hindered her escape. One of these belonged to a Carian neighbor, with whom, it is possible, she was not on the best of terms. She bore down upon his vessel and sank it. The Athenian captain concluded at once that she had changed sides and was now fighting for Greece. He abandoned the pursuit, and Artemisia escaped, and she earned praise as well. "Sire," said one of the courtiers who stood by the king's seat, "dost thou see how bravely Artemisia bears herself? She has just sunk a Greek ship." He was sure, he went on to say, that the exploit was Artemisia's, for he knew her flag. No one seemed to have suspected the truth, and fortunately for Artemisia, there was not a single survivor from the Carian ship to tell the tale. Herodotus gives no estimate of the loss on either side. A later Greek writer says that 200 Persian and 40 Greek ships were destroyed, and that the Persian loss in men was in a much greater proportion. Few of them could swim, and consequently, when a ship was sunk, the whole crew perished with it. Most of the Greeks, on the contrary, were able to save themselves by swimming. Another disaster of the king's forces was the total destruction of the Persian troops landed on the island of Pistae. Aristides disembarked with some Greek heavy arms and put them all to the sword. Among them were some of the king's own guard. Chapter 5. The Battles on the Plain and on the Shore. After the defeat at Salome, Xerxes withdrew his army into Thessaly. The result of his deliberations with his advisers was that he should himself go home, protected by a division of 60,000 men, and that his uncle, Mardonius, should stop in Greece with the intention of renewing the campaign in the following year. Mardonius was allowed to choose such portions of the army as he thought best, and having selected 300,000 men, went into winter quarters in Thessaly. It is needless to relate all that happened during the 6 months or so that passed from the opening of the campaign in the spring of 479 up to the final struggle in the early autumn of that year. It will suffice to say that Mardonius did his best to detach the Athenians from the cause of Greece by the most liberal offers, and that the Peloponnesians did all they could to bring about the same end by the consistent selfishness of their policy. To Mardonius the Athenians returned a firm refusal. To the Spartans they addressed a strong remonstrance. They represented that they had been already deserted, that the promise of help to be given for the defense of Attica had been shamefully broken. They hinted that if the Spartans and their friends persisted in neglecting every Greek interest outside the isthmus, they would be compelled, much against their will, to make terms with the enemy. The Spartans would have probably continued to temporize but for the plain speaking of a native of Tegea in Arcadia, a friendly state for which they felt the greatest respect. "No wall at the isthmus will protect us," he said, "if you drive the Athenians into alliance with Persia. They will put their fleet at the disposal of the enemy, and you will be helpless." The change in the Spartan policy was dramatically sudden. That very night, 5,000 Spartans set out for the front, a larger force than the state ever before put into the field, or was ever to put afterwards. Each Spartan had 7 light armed helots to attend it. The same number of the non-Spartan population of Laconia, each with 1 helot, followed. Mardonius, on hearing of this movement, withdrew from Attica into Boeotia and prepared to give battle. The contingents of the Peloponnesian states mustered at Corinth. As they marched north, the Athenians, who had crossed over from Salome, joined them. The whole force amounted to more than 100,000 men. It is not necessary to give all the numbers sent by the various states. The Lacedaemonians had 10,000 heavily armed, with 40,000 light armed, the Tegeans 1,500, the Athenians 8,000. The other contingents, for reasons which will shortly appear, may be left out of the account. Mardonius had constructed an entrenched camp on the north or left bank of the river Athens. In front of this camp he drew up his line of battle. The Greek army, which was under the command of Pausanias, uncle of one of the kings of Sparta and regent, took up its position on the slopes of Mount Kithaeron. Their unwillingness to descend into the plain and come to close quarters emboldened Mardonius to attack them with his cavalry. The contingent from Megara happened to be in a peculiarly advanced or otherwise exposed situation, and suffered so severely that it had to send for help. It explains Pausanias' apparent timidity when we find that he could not induce any of his troops to go to the assistance of their hard-pressed countrymen. In the end, 300 Athenians volunteered for this service. They took with them a force of archers, an arm in which Megarians were entirely deficient. Some sharp fighting ensued. At last, an arrow killed the horse of the Persian general Masissidas, and the general, a man of great stature and beauty, and a splendid figure in his gilded chain armor, was thrown to the ground. This happened close to the Athenian lines, and Mastisius was soon killed, though it was only by a thrust in the eye that he could be dispatched, so impenetrable was his armor. The Persian cavalry, as soon as it became aware of its leader's fate, charged furiously to recover the body. For a time the Greeks were driven back, but they rallied and recovered the prize. The Persians, demoralized, in the usual fashion of Asiatics, by the loss of their leader, retreated in disorder. Encouraged by this success, the Greeks descended into the plain and took up a second position on the right bank of the Sapus. The Lacedaemonians occupied the right wing, the Athenians the left. A curious instance of the want of discipline in the army is afforded by the dispute which arose between the Athenians and the Tegeans as to precedence. The first post of honor, the right wing, was conceded by common consent to the Lacedaemonians. The second part, the left wing, was the matter in dispute. Tegea claimed it on account of various mythical exploits, and on more recent successes achieved in company with Sparta. Athens had also its mythical claims, but it relied on the victory in Marathon. The decision was given in favor of Athens by a general vote of the Lacedaemonian soldiery. The new position taken up by the Greeks was found to be anything but convenient. The army suffered from a scarcity of water. It was unsafe to approach the riverbanks, for this was commanded by the Persian archers, and consequently the sole supply was a spring, known by the name of Gargaphia, which was close to the Lacedaemonian position. Mardonius shifted his line of battle a little to the west, so as to front the new Greek position. His picked native troops, the Persians and the Turkomans, were posted, not in the center, the post of honor in an Asiatic army, as we have seen more than once before, but on the left wing, where they would face the Spartans. To the Theban contingent was allotted a place on the right, where they were opposed to their old enemies of Athens. This was done at the suggestion of the Theban leaders, and the suggestion did credit, as we shall see, to their sagacity. For 10 days the two armies remained in position without moving. The soothsayers on both sides reported that the sacrifices portended success to a policy of defense, disaster if an attack should be attempted. It was to the Greek cause that the delay was more perilous. The army suffered greatly from the incessant attacks of the Persian cavalry. The scanty water supply was a great inconvenience and even a danger, and when, at the suggestion of his Theban friends, Mardonius sent his cavalry to cut off the supplies that were sent by the passes of Cithaeron into the Greek camp, the dangers of the situation were still further aggravated. But the most serious peril of all was of another kind. The spirit of party, without which no free state can exist, but by which every free state is ultimately ruined, was rife in the Greek ranks. The traitors who had shown the signal of the shield after Marathon were not absent from the ranks at Plataea. The Thebans, with malignant sagacity, suggested to Mardonius that he should rely on the influences that were working for him and avoid a general engagement. Happily for Greece, he refused their advice, which was discreditable, he said, to Persian honor, and people so superior in war had no need to resort to such expedients. He resolved to assume the offensive. The Greeks were apprised of this change of plan by a visitor from the Persian camp. After nightfall, Alexander, king of Macedonia, who claimed to be descended from the great hero Achilles, rode up to the Athenian outposts and demanded speech with the generals. They were fetched by the guard, and he told them that Mardonius had tried in vain to obtain from the sacrifices signs that promised success, but that, nevertheless, he was determined to attack. Be prepared, he went on, and if you prevail, do something for my freedom. I have risked my life for love of Greece, to save you from surprise by the barbarians. I am Alexander of Macedon. When Pausanias heard the news, he made a proposition to the Athenian generals, which, as coming from a Spartan, a race so punctilious in military honor, sounds very strange. He suggested that they should take the place of the Spartans on the right wing, where they would be opposed to the Persian infantry whom they had already conquered at Marathon, but whom the Spartans had never met in battle. The Athenians promptly agreed, but the movement was detected by Mardonius and was met by a corresponding change in his line. On perceiving this, Pausanias reverted to the former arrangement. The first offensive movement on the part of Mardonius was eminently successful. His cavalry got past, or broke through the Spartan line, so as to get at the spring of Garaphia. This they choked, and so deprived the Greek army of their only available water supply. A change of position became necessary. The new ground which the Council of War determined to occupy was near Plataea, and went by the name of the island, because it lay between two small streams which descended from Kithaeron. The army would have a water supply, and would be protected, in a degree, from the Persian cavalry. It was then too late to make the movement, which would not be practicable except under cover of darkness. The whole of the next day had to be spent in extreme discomfort, and when at nightfall orders were given for a change of position, two somewhat alarming incidents took place. The center of the Greek force, comprising all of the smaller contingents, had been so demoralized, it would seem, by the troubles of the day, that as soon as the night fell, they marched off, not to the island, but beyond it, to a place which they very probably considered to be better protected against the harassing attacks of the cavalry. This was the town of Plataea itself. They took up a position in front of the Temple of Hera, a building of considerable size, as we know from the ruins still to be seen, and on high ground. Here they had the town behind them, and ground unfavorable to the action of cavalry on either side. The other disconcerting event was the conduct of one of the Spartan officers, Amapharitus by name. This man conceived that the movement ordered by Pausanias was a retreat, and so forbidden by the strict code of Spartan military honor. Accordingly, he refused to move. An angry dispute followed, Pausanias and his second-in-command doing all they could to convince their subordinate, he obstinately adhering to his decision. In the midst of the argument, a messenger from the Athenians arrived on horseback. They were perplexed by the inaction of the Spartans, and very possibly suspicious of some design which would be compromising to their own safety. At the moment of this messenger's arrival, Amapharitus had delivered his ultimatum. Taking up from the ground a huge stone, he cast it at the feet of Pausanias, saying at the same time, "I give my vote for staying." The same word serves in Greek for vote and pebble, pebbles being used in the ballot boxes. Pausanias hurriedly explained the situation to the Athenian, and begged him to carry back a message that he hoped his countrymen would not move till he could overcome the difficulty in which he found himself. This, indeed, seemed almost hopeless. At last, just before dawn, Pausanias made up his mind to leave the refractory captain behind. Finding himself alone with his company, he would, he hoped, consent to follow. And this was what actually took place. By this time, day was dawning, and Mardonius became aware of what had happened. He seems to have looked upon the movement in much the same way as Amapharitus had done. It was a flight. These Spartans, for all their boasted courage, were running away. His Persian troops answered the command by a disorderly advance. They crossed the Esopus, which, it will be remembered, flow in front of their position, and hurried in the track of the Spartans. The rest of the Asiatics followed their example. Pausanias sent a message to the Athenians, telling them that the Persians were concentrating their whole strength against his division, and begging that they would come to his help, at least by sending their archers. The Athenians, however, had by this time work enough of their own to deal with, for the Thebans and Thessalians had commenced an attack upon them. The Spartans therefore had to bear the brunt of the Persian attack alone. They had 10,000 heavy armed and 4 times as many light armed, numbers slightly increased by the contingent from Tegea, a force of 3,000, equally divided between the two classes of troops. Pausanias, who seems to have shown little ability or presence of mind from the beginning to the end of the campaign, was busy with the customary sacrifice. Unfortunately, the victim showed no encouraging signs, and he was content, possibly was compelled by the public opinion of his men, for a Greek army, even when it came from Sparta, was a democracy, to postpone any movement of offense till the fates seemed propitious. Meanwhile, his men were falling about him. One of the slain was reputed to be the handsomest man in the whole Greek army. In an agony of distress, Pausanias lifted his eye to the temple of Hera, which stood on a conspicuous height, and prayed for the help of the goddess. The signs immediately changed, and the welcome signal of charge was given. The Tegeans seemed to have already moved. Together, they advanced against the Persian line, which was protected by a rampart of wickered shields, from behind which the archers had been pouring volley of arrows. The rampart was soon broken down. Then a fierce hand-to-hand fight began. Again and again the Persian braves dashed themselves on the Spartan spears, and broke or strived to break them. They were not one whit inferior to the Greeks in boldness and warlike spirit. Such is the testimony which men who had borne their part in that fierce struggle bore to the bravery of their antagonists. For their armament was less effective, and their military training less complete. The battle raged most furiously about the person of Mardonius, who was surrounded by a bodyguard of 1,000 immortals. As long as he lived, these picked warriors held their own. When he was struck down, a Spartan, Amistadus by name, had the credit of the deed. They flew in wild confusion to their camp. A body of 40,000 was led off the field by the general in command when he saw how the fortune of the day was going. On the right wing of the Persian army, the Theban infantry, always distinguished for its steady courage, held its own for a considerable time against the Athenians. It stood alone, however. The other Greeks, whom Xerxes or his lieutenant had pressed into the Persian service, felt no zeal for the cause, and took the first opportunity that occurred of retreating. The Thebans, who must have been much inferior in numbers to their Athenian adversaries, were driven back with a considerable loss and killed. They took refuge within the walls of their city. Their cavalry, indeed, achieved the only success that the army of Mardonius could boast. News reached the Greek center, in its position outside Plataea, that the right wing had put the Persians to flight, and it hurriedly advanced to take a share in the victory. The movement was made in a careless and disorderly way. So relaxed was discipline that the whole force did not even keep together. Two of the contingents, from Megara and Phyllis, a small state in the north of the Peloponnese, were attacked by the Theban cavalry as they crossed the plain and suffered a very heavy loss, as many as 600 being slain. So they perished without honor, says Herodotus. It must be owned that from first to last the smaller Greek states earned little distinction in the war. The Persian entrenched camp was for a time a difficulty. The Spartans attacked it but made no progress, being wholly unacquainted with the methods of assaulting fortified places. They had to await the arrival of the Athenians, who seemed to have had, if not more experience, at least more intelligence. With their help, the camp was taken by assault. The spoil was very great. Pausanias says that he saw at Athens the golden scimitar of Mardonius, taken from his tent on the day of the victory. The loss of the Persians was, of course, very great. Herodotus says that only 3,000 survived. This may be an exaggeration, but it is doubtless true that the chances of escape were very small, and that no mercy would be shown. Of the Greeks, 159 are said to have fallen. To this number must be added the 600 cut off by the Theban cavalry, and about as many more who fell in the preliminary conflicts. Plutarch, while giving the same number as Herodotus, states that the total Greek loss, from first to last, was 1,360. Among the Spartan dead were Amypharatus and Aristometus, the unhappy survivor of Thermopylae. Two of the Greek contingents, from Mantinea and from Elis, arrived after the battle was over. They find the generals whose tardiness had deprived them of all share in the glory of the victory. Much might be said of what was done by the conquerors to commemorate their victory, but my task is finished when the battle has been described. For one curious story, however, I must find room. Out of the tenth of the spoil dedicated to the Delphian Apollo, a golden tripod, or cauldron, supported by 3 legs, was made. This tripod rested on a bronze pedestal. The gold was plundered by the Phocians about a century and a half later, but the pedestal was carried by the Emperor Constantine to his new capital on the Bosphorus. This relic was seen by English travelers in the 17th century and was more minutely examined at the time of the Crimean War. The original inscription put by Pausanias was erased by the Lacedaemonians, a list of the states that took part in the battle being substituted. Solvents applied to the rust that accumulated on the metal made this list legible. It contains the name of states which we know to have had no claim to the honor. This exactly agrees with what Herodotus tells us. Systematic falsification of history was carried on by the cities which by their misfortune or their fault took no part in the victory. The combined Greek fleet did little or nothing after the victory at Salamis. Themistocles proposed, indeed, a vigorous policy. The Persians should be closely pursued, the bridge across the Hellespont destroyed, and the whole of the invading army destroyed. The Spartans took a different line, urging that Greece would do well to let an enemy, who might still be dangerous, depart without further molestation. This policy had something to be said for it, and Sparta carried the other allies with her. The Asiatic Greeks, however, were not disposed to lose the opportunity of freedom. In the spring of the following year, 479, they sent envoys to the leaders of the Greek fleet, which was then stationed at Aegina, begging them to follow up the successes already won. The envoys found their task a very difficult one. The Spartan Leochides, who was in command, was unwilling to undertake the responsibility. He moved as far eastward as Delos, and there remained. Later in the year, another effort was made, this time by 3 natives of Samos, which was then governed by a tyrant established in power by the Persians. The envoys urged on Leochides the duty of helping his fellow Greeks to escape from the Persian yoke, and enlarged on the prospects of success. "Stranger," said the Spartan to the spokesman of the embassy, "tell me your name." "Hegestratus, army leader," answered the man. "I accept the omen," cried Leochides, and the resolution to advance was taken. The Greek admirals had expected to find the Persian fleet at Samos. In this they were disappointed. It had left the island and had taken up a position on the mainland, where it would have the assistance of the army, numbering, we are told, 60,000, which had been left to overawe the Greek cities. The place was Mycale, now known as Cape St. Mary. The channel between the mainland and Samos is here at its narrowest. The ships were beached and protected by a rampart made of stones and timber. The first thing that Leochides did, doubtless suggested by the action of Themistocles at Artemisium, was to approach the Greeks serving in the Persian camp. He caused his ship to be brought as close as possible to the shore and instructed a herald to proclaim, as he moved slowly along, a message to the Greeks. "Men of Ionia," such were the words, "when we join battle with the Persians, remember freedom." They might, he thought, act upon the suggestion and turn their arms against the Persians. Anyhow, it would cause distrust and suspicion. The latter anticipation was at once fulfilled. The Persians disarmed the Samians and sent the contingent from Miletus to a distant spot, which they were to guard, the real object being to get them out of the way. This done, they prepared to defend themselves against the Greeks, who were now advancing to the attack. And now there happened one of the strange events to which we may safely give the neutral name of coincidence. As the Greeks moved forward, a rumor ran from one end of the army to the other that a great battle had been won in Boeotia. At the same time, someone saw a herald's staff lying on the shore. The common belief at the time was, of course, in a divine interference. Later on, the skeptical explanation that the commanders invented the story to encourage their troops became current. The strange phenomena of thought currents, brainwaves, etc., familiar to modern experience, will perhaps account for the story as satisfactorily as can be expected. Anyhow, the report was true. The Battle of Plataea had been fought and won in the morning of the day of Mycale. The actual conflict was very like that which occurred at Plataea. As we hear no more of the stockade of stone and timber with which the ships were protected, we may presume that the Greeks delivered their attack on the flank of the Persian position. Here, a wicker rampart had been extemporized, just as it had been at Plataea. With the help of this, the Persians were able for a time to hold their own. Herodotus goes so far as to say that they had not the worst of the battle. But the Athenians, anxious to secure the honors of the day before the Spartans arrived, renewed the attack with fresh vigor, broke down the wicker rampart, and pursued the flying enemy to their fortified camp. For a time, even when the rampart had fallen, the valiant Persians maintained the struggle. Then, overpowered by fresh arrivals, they slowly fell back. The Greek army advanced in 2 divisions, the Athenians and the contingents brigaded with them marching over the level ground by the sea. The Spartans, with the Peloponnesians generally, taking an inland route which led them over some rough and difficult country. Naturally, their progress was not rapid, and the battle was virtually decided when they reached the field of action. To the very last, the Persians showed all the courage and pluck of a ruling race. The Greek victory was by no means bloodless. The contingent from Sicyon, in particular, lost heavily. The result of the day, however, was definite enough. Some survivors from the battle contrived to escape to the hills, and thence to Sardis, but the army, as a whole, ceased to exist. The ships were naturally abandoned. Perhaps this was the most important of the Greek successes, for it meant the liberation of the islands of the Aegean. These were finally rescued from the yoke which had been heavy on them for half a century. Thank you for joining me in reading The Time Away. Please hit the like button, share with your friends, or leave a comment below. Until our next escape, goodbye.